Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, as Pakistan attempts to broker peace between the United States and Iran, JD Vance has been touted for a new role in those negotiations. Rachel Reeves outlines her plan to deal with soaring energy costs resulting from the war on Iran. Our man in Havana, Novara's very own Steven Methven, reports from Cuba amid a nationwide blackout, and an interview with Ted Cruz suggests that Republicans have basically given up on any kind of domestic agenda when it comes to the United States. I'm Bastani, and tonight, of course, I'm joined by Kieran and Andrieu. Kieran, how are you?
As ever, privileged to be here with you, Aaron. And I note we have a wide lens on the camera, which means that the conspiracy theorists, the compartmentalists who said that we were secretly in different rooms but pretending, surely now they are going to cross the threshold and believe us.
Well, look, if AI can make you think that Netanyahu's still alive, then it can do this. And I'm, of course, kidding. He is still with us, although that's a conspiracy theory. I wish they'd gone a little bit longer in playing us all along. If you'd like to support our work here at Novara Media, you can, of course, sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Help us build a new media for different politics. And, of course, make sure to let me know what you think tonight. What's playing on your mind? What should we be talking about? What really matters that we're missing out on? Put that in the YouTube chat. You can, of course, make a super chat if you like, but we prefer that support because Alphabet doesn't get 40% of it. Donald Trump probably jumped the gun on Monday when he suggested there had been positive talks between the US and Iran. But conversations of some kind between the two sides, likely via intermediaries, do appear to be taking place. According to The Guardian, Pakistan's military leadership has been attempting to broker negotiations between Washington and Tehran. But there's a twist. They report that instead of Steve Witkoff or Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, representing Washington, it might be the turn of Vice President JD Vance. The Guardian reports that Iran has told Pakistani mediators they would be unwilling to enter into negotiations led by Witkoff or Kushner, who they regard as having acted in bad faith before the war. And they say that with good reason. Witkoff and Kushner have been blamed for blowing up previous talks, and not just by the Iranians. This is from a report from the Times of Israel published on February the 28th, the day after Trump went to war. US President Donald Trump decided on Friday to attack Iran after hearing from top US envoys that the latest Iranian counter-proposal in the US-Iran nuclear talks was, quote, bullshit and intended only to buy Tehran time, a senior US official tells Channel 12. Trump's envoys for the nuclear talks, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, had conducted, quote, serious negotiations with the Iranians, hoping in earnest to reach a deal, but felt ultimately that the Iranians were not willing to compromise on US demands, according to the official. After the latest round of talks in Geneva on Thursday, Kushner and Witkoff told US Vice President JD Vance over the phone that talks, quote, aren't going anywhere. We're very disappointed. So that's the Times of Israel confirming Trump decided to go to war off the back of Kushner and Witkoff telling him negotiations were, quote, bullshit. Yet when that article was written, the Omanis, who convened the US-Iran negotiations in the first place, confirmed Iran had been willing to make very real concessions. In the hours before Trump went to war, their foreign minister went on American TV begging for more time for those negotiations to run their course.
If the ultimate objective is to ensure forever that Iran cannot have a nuclear bomb, I think we have cracked that problem through these negotiations by agreeing a very important breakthrough that has never been achieved any time before. And I think if we can capture that and build on it, I think a deal is within our reach.
What has Iran agreed to you that they have never done before? Can you give us any sense?
The single most important achievement, I believe, is the agreement that Iran will never, ever have a nuclear material that will create a bomb. This is, I think, a big achievement. This is something that is not in the old deal that was negotiated during President Obama's time. This is something completely new. it really makes the enrichment argument less relevant, because now we are talking about zero stockpiling. And that is very, very important, because if you cannot stockpile material that is enriched, then there is no way you can actually create a bomb, whether you enrich or don't enrich. And I think this is really something that has been missed a lot by the media, and I want to clarify that from the standpoint of a mediator.
That was quite a long clip to show you from an interview 3 weeks ago. I get it, but I think it's a crucial record of how unnecessary and how reckless and how stupid this war was. And so it deserves to be returned to again and again and again. And the Omanis have also been open about why Kushner and Witkoff repeatedly rejected any kind of compromise. This is from a Guardian report on how the pre-war negotiations between the United States and Iran broke down. One Gulf diplomat who has direct knowledge of the talks and is furious with Witkoff and Kushner's behaviour described the pair as, quote, Israeli assets that had conspired to force the US president into entering a war from which he is now desperate to get himself out of. One Gulf diplomat. Not the Iranians, not some guy on X, a Gulf diplomat. People with skin in the game. Their countries get bombed when this goes wrong. That is not the case for Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. With respect to Jared Kushner, at least, that idea is not too far-fetched, by the way. His father, Charles Kushner, had been a major donor to pro-Israeli causes with close personal ties to Netanyahu, who once stayed at the Kushner family home. So, could replacing Witkoff and Kushner with J.D. Vance make it easier to end the Iran war? Well, don't get too excited. Vance is still very pro-Israel. During the Gaza genocide, he criticised Biden for allegedly micromanaging the Israelis. Presumably, he wanted Israel to have even greater flexibility to bomb homes and hospitals and school kids. However, he's also been clear that Israeli and American interests don't always align. Indeed, they often diverge. He said this in October 2024.
So obviously, Israel has the right to defend itself, but America's interest is sometimes going to be distinct. Like sometimes we're going to have overlapping interests, and sometimes we're going to have distinct interests. And our interest, I think, very much is in not going to war with Iran, right? It would be huge distraction of resources. It would be massively expensive to our country.
From the horse's mouth. J.D. Vance was reminded of those statements in a press conference in the Oval Office last week. Here's how he responded.
I think that I know what you're trying to do, Phil. You're trying to drive a wedge between members of the administration, between me and the president. What the president said consistently, going back to 2015, and I agreed with him, is that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. We have taken this military action under the president's leadership. I think all of us, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, should pray for success and pray for the safety of our troops. That's the approach that I've taken. Make it as successful as possible.
Pray for success. Hardly bodes well, does it? We should make it as successful as possible. It's hardly a ringing endorsement of Trump's decision to bomb Iran. It's certainly not a strategy. And Politico has reported via White House sources that Vance was indeed a skeptical voice in the White House regarding Iran strikes. Kieran, look, this might just be a Fugazi, it might be a nothing burger, but it could also be something really substantial, right? It does seem like Witkoff and Kushner played a central role in spiking what were potentially very productive talks. And to be clear, Iran, according to the Omani foreign minister, was offering an outcome, a compromise that nobody had ever achieved before, and still the Americans said, we're not interested.
And it's a really important testimony. And I believe the Omani foreign minister. But even if you don't actually have to believe his version of events, because Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's former chief of staff from 1997 to 2007, so throughout the whole Iraq war period, by no means a dove on foreign policy. Memos and documents. He was sent by Keir Starmer as a national security advisor to oversee, from Britain's perspective, or at least observe some of these talks, these negotiations. And his conclusion was that he felt Iran was being far more magnanimous, probably isn't the word, but far more willing to compromise than he had previously expected. That's Jonathan Powell's opinion. And actually, he didn't expect it to be published. These were documents which have subsequently been put into the public domain that the private memo private memos, private notes. So you don't actually have to take the Omani foreign minister's word to believe what he's saying. I think, Aaron, overall, what I would say about this is that the split within the MAGA movement that started among the opinion formers within MAGA, but still grassroots in the sense that they're not the politicians, so Tucker Carlson, the split within that part of the MAGA movement has now made its way up to the administration. And it was always predictable that Israel was going to be the wedge that created that splinter, or created that set of two factions. Because Israel, uses loads and loads of US money. And if you're America first, and you're serious about America first, eventually you're going to start asking, as Tucker Carlson has, wait, why are we sending loads of money to these guys? Now, Tucker Carlson is probably going to run for president. He has his own motivations, blah, blah, blah. We know that. But it doesn't render anything he's saying about this untrue. So there's that. And the other thing is that if you're not into foreign intervention, Israel is going to be a nightmare for you, because Israel always wants to get you into foreign wars. So the money thing, the war thing, it was inevitable that Israel was going to, if anything it was inevitable that Israel was going to be the cause of this ruction. On J.D. Vance, I don't know, but I think it reflects that split now that's made its way up to the administration. I don't know if it will significantly change the course of things. They've clearly got themselves into a terrible cul-de-sac here, and they're desperately trying to find their way out. But I do think it's significant, Aaron. I do think it's significant that Witkoff and Kushner have been sidelined and J.D. Vance has been brought in, and I think it reflects the serious frustration on the part of many prominent MAGA people, Tucker Carlson first among them. It reflects the fact that's made it up to the administration level, and I also think it reflects the fact that they've let the genie out the bottle. The global economy is spiraling very quickly, and we can talk more about that later. So, yeah, I think it's significant.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be one of the major stories of the next couple of weeks and months, and we'll be talking about the British economy and the implications of all of this shortly. I should say, Jared Kushner seems to have a very high opinion of himself. He doesn't seem a particularly impressive person. And I'm somebody who looks at these things structurally, right? And incentives and disincentives. But I do think that, for whatever reason, Kushner and Witkoff have really screwed something up here. And to go from a moment where the Iranians are willing to make even bigger concessions than the JCPOA, the biggest concessions ever made by the Islamic Republic of Iran, ever, to go from that within 48 hours to killing their head of state in Ramadan can only be viewed, I think, as vindictive and literally trying to catalyze a war rather than to reach your objectives. That's only my reading on it.
Final thought on that, Aaron.
Please.
Completely and utterly agree with every word. And what I would say is, I'm going to put it really bluntly, Witkoff and Kushner are assets of the Israeli government. Doesn't mean that they work for the Israeli government, literally. You know, we had this whole debate about Epstein. Was he an asset? Wasn't he? As long as they are doing things through the prism of Israel's interests, at least equal to the US interest or more than the US interest, I would argue it's the latter in this case, more than the US interest, they are Israeli government assets. And it's so clear to me that that is a truism in this case.
Yeah, I mean, we should just quickly, before we go to the next part of the story, you have the Omani foreign minister making these claims. He also wrote a really impressive essay in The Economist saying something quite similar. You then have a Gulf source saying that they're Israeli assets. You have Jonathan Powell saying that. I mean, there's a range of people here. At a certain point, you take a step back and say, this isn't normal. And whoever's in the White House, Democrat, Republican, as you kind of pointed out a moment ago, Israel's going to create issues. If you want to pivot to East Asia, if you think China is the major problem and we need to get out of the Middle East, can't do it. If you want to be isolationist, if you don't want to have anything to do with anybody, can't do it. If you want to reduce overseas aid, Elon Musk and Donald Trump were talking about reducing US aid, scrapping all these state agencies, giving money to this or that cause in other parts of the world. Good luck when you've got the Israel lobby. So I think this is a perennial problem for whatever faction in the White House, whichever of the two major parties. Trump today reposted on Truth Social a tweet from Pakistan's Prime Minister offering to host peace talks. This is Trump posting Shehbaz Sharif, who says this: Pakistan welcomes and fully supports ongoing efforts to pursue dialogue to end the war, all caps, in the Middle East in the interest of peace and stability in the region and beyond. Subject to concurrence by the US and Iran, Pakistan stands ready and honoured to be the host to facilitate meaningful and conclusive talks for a comprehensive settlement of the ongoing conflict. Interestingly, it's Witkoff and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi who are tagged there, as well as Donald Trump. The Guardian suggests neither will be the real players, as we've already discussed, and they say the Iranians want Vance. And as for who would represent Iran, their parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, is who Trump seems to believe he can do business with. Politico is today reporting that the Trump administration is eyeing up Ghalibaf as a potential US-backed leader. This is from that piece. He's a hot option, one administration official said, cautioning that no decisions have been made. He's one of the highest, but we've got to test them, and we can't rush into it. It's all about installing someone like Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela, that we say, we're going to keep you there, we're going to not take you out, you're going to work with us, you're going to give us a good deal, a first deal on the oil, the administration official said. We're in the testing phase of really trying to figure out who can rise and who wants to rise, who tries to rise, the official said. And then as people rise, we'll do a quick test. And if they're radical, we'll take them out. They have no idea what they're talking about. Anybody that does a Delcy Rodriguez in Iran will be assassinated by the Revolutionary Guard before you can finish your breakfast. They do not understand a state and an ideology and a cadre like Iran, Shia Islam, the IRGC. That sounds like an administration who doesn't know much about Iran, as I just said. Someone who does, though, is Vali Nasr, who we had on the show a couple of weeks ago. He did a great interview with us. He tweeted this today. While there's a lot of attention on Ghalibaf, the appointment of former IRGC General Zolqadar deserves more attention. Ghalibaf may be the hot ticket for the White House, but Zolqadar is the reality on the ground. Zolqadar is Mojtaba's man. That's Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the former supreme leader. And the selection shows that Mojtaba is in charge. It also confirms that all Israel's decapitation has achieved is to transfer power in Tehran to the most hawkish part of the Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC. Zolqadar comes from that wing of the IRGC. He was so extreme as deputy commander of the IRGC that Qasem Soleimani, decided to leave the IRGC. Khamenei, senior, personally called him back and put him in charge of the Quds Force. That's the extraterritorial wing of the IRGC, kind of like the SAS. Zolqadar had a hand in suppressions of protesters in 1999 and 2009 and was instrumental in Ahmadinejad's elections to presidency. His selection to replace Larijani does not suggest there will be talks with US, but rather a much more aggressive Iranian posture. Personally, I'm going to side with Vali Nasr, the Johns Hopkins academic who is connected with Iran and is Iranian, than some random White House person who seems to think this is Venezuela part 2, because there's nothing to suggest so far that Iran is like Venezuela.
No. I mean, everything that Iran has done so far has, I genuinely believe, completely caught Israel and the United States off guard. They've punched so hard above their weight. They punched so hard above their weight that they have... I mean, remember that 2 weeks ago, Aaron, we were hearing about ground troops. We were hearing about the evisceration of Iran's energy infrastructure. We were hearing in the more kind of Dr. Strangelove-like circles of potentially the need for nuclear weapons. And now we're hearing about peace, love and understanding. And the reason we're hearing peace, love and understanding is because the Iranians have raised the costs. They've calibrated their strategic calculations in such a way that they have effectively raised the costs for the US and for Israel. And it's very obvious that's why only through force are we hearing a change in rhetoric and potentially a change in direction. But yeah, they regard these states as black boxes. Don't ask what's inside the black box. It's just about the outputs. That's all that matters. Venezuela, Iraq, Iran. Doesn't matter what's inside the society. It's irrelevant. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. And they'll just fall in place or fall into line because they're not fully developed three-dimensional people like Americans or Europeans. That is the kind of mentality that underpins it, subconscious or conscious. And they learn the hard way time and time again, and yet they don't learn.
You know, I had a conversation on X with somebody before this started, about a week before this started, and they were talking about how easy Iran would be. They were an American. And I said, how come you guys do this every 25 years? You know, with unerring timeliness. Every 25 years, it seems to go and go and go and go. And just to be clear about Iran, is Iran a superpower? No, Iran is not a superpower. But it is a country with 2/3 the population of the Russian Federation. 2/3, 93 million people, has a younger average age. It produces its own ballistic missiles. Only 3 Muslim countries do that, Pakistan and Turkey. Would the United States invade Pakistan or Turkey? I don't think so. So you look at that and you think, well, at the very least, this is a very substantial challenge. But that doesn't seem to have been factored into thinking, whether or not we're talking about the White House or even just much of the American body politic. Rachel Reeves today outlined the government's response to the economic fallout from the war on Iran. And the big takeaway was that, unlike when Russia invaded Ukraine, there would not be universal support to help reduce energy bills.
As we respond to this crisis, we must learn the mistakes of the past. The previous government pushed up borrowing, interest rates, inflation and mortgage costs with an unfunded, untargeted package of support under Liz Truss. That gave the support to the most wealthiest of households. Between 2022 and 2024, under the last government, households in the top income decile received an average of £1,350 of direct energy bill support. That left us with high levels of national debt. A cheque written then for a bill that is still being paid today. I can confirm to the House that contingency planning is taking place for every eventuality, so that we can keep costs down for everyone and provide support for those who need it most, acting within our ironclad fiscal rules to keep inflation and interest rates as low as possible.
As well as ruling out universal support, Reeves pledged to give the Competition and Markets Authority, quote, the powers that they need that were denied to them by the previous government to detect and to crack down on price gouging. The Resolution Foundation, a think tank, has backed the Chancellor. Their chief executive said this. The Chancellor is right to say the government will look to target support with energy bills at families that need it the most, rather than repeat the blank cheque approach of the last crisis. It's essential we avoid schemes with uncapped costs that can lead to a doom loop of higher interest rates and higher borrowing. Of course, I'm laughing because Liz Truss did a universalist scheme, which was about big state spending, and that was the left of where Rachel Reeves is. You might not think that's left-wing, but generically that's how we view these things. The economist Lord O'Neill has also backed Reeves. O'Neill has worked for Labour and Tory governments, and when he was an economist at Goldman Sachs, he was famous for coining the term BRICS.
The bond market has reacted, as it has all over the world, pretty negatively to the past fortnight, including in the United States. And if markets perceive that yet again Western governments are going to throw all sorts of support packages at vulnerable consumers very quickly, and ones that we can't get out of just as quickly, the markets are right to get concerned. We cannot constantly keep throwing what is ultimately taxpayers' money at supporting people if there's never any mechanism to take it back. And I think the Chancellor, for now, said exactly the right things, because she kept it pretty clear that in the event of when they, I think it was responsiveness and agile was the comment she used, if it looks like it's going to be more persistent and really bad, then they probably will do targeted things, which I think for those in the most difficult circumstances might be appropriate too. But the idea that, I don't know whether it's the 24/7 media world, that, you know, as soon as there's a bit of a crisis, the government of the day has to react dramatically with yet more taxpayers' money. We've got to put a stop to this in the country.
Zach Polanski has argued that Reeves' package doesn't go nearly far enough. Here's what he said. This is an unbelievably weak response from the Chancellor to the enormous bill hikes facing households in the UK. Monitoring the situation, considering new powers, Reeves's lukewarm words show that she and her government simply do not understand the scale of the cost of living crisis about to hit this country. Then this afternoon, Morgan Stanley said this. The UK is heading for a recession if the energy price shock continues, according to a Wall Street bank. Morgan Stanley said the Bank of England could raise interest rates if energy prices fail to come down. which would be likely to cause an economic downturn by the end of 2026. Bruno Scarica, chief UK economist at Morgan Stanley, said Britain would face, quote, a pronounced UK recession at the turn of the year if energy prices stay at recent highs in the coming months and borrowing costs rise. That's in the Telegraph. Serious. They're calling it the Trump session, the most stupid, avoidable recession ever. A lot of people are saying it. Earlier today, I spoke to Angus Hanton, author of the book Vassal State, How America Runs Britain. This was his take on how Reeves and Starmer are reacting to the economic fallout of the war on Iran.
The discussions have been about what will happen to the price of energy for consumers. And it seems to me that that is a factor. It's important and it's a consideration, but it's not the only thing. And I'm sure Reeves and Starmer are concerned about a much wider thing than that. So it's also about whether a downturn in the economy will cut the tax base and make it unaffordable for us to pay the things that we've committed to paying, including, for example, pensions. It's also about, as you say, what will happen to the interest rates. Interest rates have gone up above 5%. Now, the sums are quite straightforward. If you've got a £3 trillion of borrowing and interest rates are 5%, it takes time to work through, but if they're 5%, that means £150 billion of interest each year, which is 15% of the tax take. Bear in mind, we spend another 150 billion on the state pension. That means interest in the state pension take you to 30% of the tax take, and the NHS costs just over 200 billion. So we're now at 50% of the tax take just to pay for NHS, state pension, and our interest payments. So I think the bit you're asking about, the interest payments, it's critical. I mean, they were hoping that it would go down below 4%, and the difference of 1% is, it's 30 billion a year.
Which is, I think the policing budget for England and Wales is about 18, 19 billion.
Yep.
So it's an extra 50% above the policing budget. I mean, this is really extraordinary. When Liz Truss came in with the kamikaze budget, Aaron Kwasi Kwarteng, I remember, I think in one calendar year, the costs of servicing interest went up by about 35 billion, or maybe in about 6 months. And that's, basically twice the policing budget of England and Wales. And it just wasn't being factored into the conversation, again, particularly from the right. They talk about, we need to reduce income tax and reduce corporation tax and reduce that. Okay, well, great. But in an aging population where, like you say, 10, 15% of your GDP is going on servicing public debt, that's simply not possible. You cannot have a low tax economy. No. Is that ever going to cut through to these people? Because I know with ideologues, it's hard to cut through to them because they have ideological claims they firmly believe in. But because they haven't changed their tune since Liz Truss.
Well, I think what would cut through would be a financial crisis. The people are, what's in the background that people are sort of referring to obliquely is basically the bond markets. And the bond markets aren't they are individuals, a group of individuals who are assessing Britain's ability to pay its debts and are deciding how much they're going to pay for bonds. And the rate they pay for bonds reflects their attitude, their appraisal of the state of the British economy and the willingness of the government to make difficult decisions in order to keep the economy so that it can pay its debts. So I think we're in a situation where there are these shadow actors behind the scenes, and one of the biggest is the bond markets.
Final question. Given we're moving seemingly to a more multipolar world, by which I mean more of global GDP is outside of what we consider the West historically, technological innovation is becoming more diffuse. China's getting very good at some things. For instance, global cities aren't just in North America and Europe anymore. You've got Singapore, you did have Dubai until about 10 minutes ago, other places as well. So that's changing. We are moving towards a more multipolar world. The question is how quickly and what does that look like? But it's strange that we're moving towards multipolarity, and at the same time, the British establishment is cleaving ever closer to the United States with the presumption of unipolarity. One, why do you think that is? And two, what do you think a sensible foreign policy looks like in the changing world that now confronts us?
Yes, well, old habits die hard, and we're looking increasingly isolated, having aligned ourselves with a bloc 2,000 miles away. when there's another important political and economic bloc 20 miles away. I think we need to continue to be friendly to the Americans, and like the French, we can be allies of the Americans, but the French model is far better. Allies, but independent. We should make build much closer links with Europe. I mean, the Labour Party in recent weeks have said as much, but they're hesitant to say it too loudly because they don't want anyone to think that they're in favour of rejoining the EU, which I am, by the way. I think it would just make a lot of sense. But even if we don't rejoin the EU, we should be closer to them. And the EU was essentially an economic union, but it's sort of economic and political, but it's morphing into something that's looking like it needs to be something more military as well. And it seems to me we should be throwing in our lot with the French and the Germans rather than being a sort of aircraft carrier of Europe for the Americans.
I said final question, but actually just building on this, because I was at a debate the best part of a year ago now about should we end the special relationship? And I'm happy to say it to you, I plagiarized tons of your arguments, right? At the start of my 5-minute speech, I said, I came here, I paid with Apple Pay on my Apple phone, on my iPhone, and this is being streamed on YouTube, and you bought your tickets through Ticketmaster, and the payment system for unheard is Stripe, blah, 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 blah. All digital infrastructure is American-owned, American firms. And actually, over the course of the evening, and of course, this is unheard, most of the people are on the right. There was a lady who came up to me afterwards. She was from somewhere in Central Europe. I think she was maybe Polish. She said, I work in equity for an equity fund. You're absolutely right. Everything you said is correct. The Brits should be more assertive about their own, possibilities and opportunities. So that was very much a centre-right audience, and they were listening to what I said, and some of them were even persuaded. Has that been your experience with this stuff over the last couple of years? I do occasionally read the Telegraph or something, and I'll see your name cited.
Yes, very much. I think I'm really pleased that it's been a sort of wake-up call that people have been waking up to. Yeah, and people have been saying to me, this is what I've always thought, but I didn't dare say it. And so that people are realising that the special relationship is essentially, at the moment, it's an exploitative relationship. I would even go so far as to say in many ways it's been an abusive relationship, although that's obviously a term with other connotations that I don't intend. Of course, we've got a special relationship in the sense that we speak a similar language. There are a lot of cultural and other links. And just speaking for myself, I've got American cousins. And a lot of us have got friends who've moved to America or friends who've come from America. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something quite different. We're talking about politics and economics. And in terms of the special political relationship, that's the one that I think has become abusive and exploitative, and that Keir Starmer's in a difficult position, but he should do more to assert independence. What's quite interesting is, at least because Donald Trump is so unpopular in Europe and in the UK as well, the extent to which Starmer has asserted his independence in the last week or two has meant that it's increased his popularity. So that's a very encouraging thing, that we've got to a political situation where you say you want to be more independent of America and you get more votes for it. So I don't think the May elections, it'll be a direct result of that. The May elections won't be quite as disastrous for Labour as we had expected.
That was Angus Hanton speaking to me earlier today. We will have a much longer version of that interview, the full interview, out tomorrow. I think it was about an hour. Angus, very smart guy, by the way, very good communicator on screen, but he's a fantastic writer. This book, Vassal State, How America Runs Britain, is a must read, a must read. I think it was in my top 5 books of 2024, I'm pretty sure. A must read. It confirms lots of your suspicions about stuff, but guess what? It's even worse than you thought. Cuba has seen its second nationwide power cut in a week, with illegal US sanctions constricting basic public services in the country. As 10 million people were plunged into darkness, Novara's very own Steven Methven was on the ground in Havana. Here's his latest dispatch, featuring Irish rap trio Kneecap.
We have such shared history, and just to see everyone out there, the resilience Havana is in a total blackout at the moment. The lights went off really just after NECAP finished their set. The big concert that was happening in the centre today. There are, generators and bits of the grid that work. Hang on, I'm going to have to light myself up with my phone a bit. Okay, there we go. There are bits of the grid that work, generators that work. Hang on, a street party happening around here. But, being in the dark isn't the only way that the energy crisis has been affecting Cubans. So, for example, movement is really difficult. There are no buses, there are no communal taxis. The taxis that Cubans normally use, which take pesos, have doubled or tripled their prices since the crisis began, which means that people are walking a lot. Like people are walking, I know one guy who is walking 4 hours every day to get to work and back. And then he's on his feet all day because he works in a hotel. Prices in general are going up. If you can't move people, you can't move goods. So you can't move food and other essential supplies. That means they've become scarcer, and so prices have gone up. The other thing that's been hit is tourism. This would be the peak season now, or coming into the peak season for tourism. And the hotels are empty. One hotel that we were supposed to stay in as part of the Italian delegation, we were turned away when we arrived because they had no electricity and no water. Also, it's not helped by the fact that loads of Western governments have told people not to come to Cuba. They've said, don't come to Cuba because the situation is unstable and could deteriorate really quickly. And what they don't say is why that's the case. They don't say it's the case because Donald Trump has blockaded all oil to the country. They make it sound like a natural disaster might occur at any moment, whereas actually it's a very man-made disaster, a very American man-made disaster. It is, I gotta say, very strange to be walking around a major city in complete darkness. But, people here have grown sort of used to it. They're sitting outside on the pavement, chatting, drinking. People aren't happy, I'm not going to lie. People aren't, overjoyed. I met a lot of people who are, very critical of the government, very angry with the current government, but not anti-revolutionary. They don't want the Americans here. They don't want any of that. They often talk very highly of Fidel Castro, how much they miss him, but they're not happy with how things are right now, and who really can blame them?
Kieran, what are your thoughts on Cuba right now?
I think it's completely insane what's going on. I mean, if you look at the dynamic within the US of the kind of anti-Cuba movement or the anti-Castro movement, whatever you want to call it, there have been so many punctuation points where actually Cuba was almost effectively decolonized from US imperialism, or not effectively decolonized in total, but there were significant strides towards a kind of rapprochement. So one of those actually, strangely, is the mid-1970s with what was called the Jackson-Vanik attempts by Henry Kissinger, obviously monster of monsters, to try and thaw relations with Moscow and with China, and that would have had impacts on the blockade of Cuba. And to oppose that, a guy called Henry Jackson, who gives his name to the Henry Jackson Society, and a guy called Vanik signed a bill, sponsored a bill, which pushed back against it. Jump forward to the 1990s, you have Bill Clinton, the Clinton administration, tried to loosen relations with Cuba. It wouldn't have been a lifting of the blockade as such, but it would have allowed for some trade, it would have allowed for some aid. And the Helms-Burton Act is signed to push back against it in 1996. There is a derangement around Cuba within within Congress, basically. It always comes from Congress. And what that makes me think is that the Cuban diaspora, as they call themselves, in the United States is massively responsible for this capture of the American political system. And that sounds all very kind of nerdy and technical, but actually it means that we are in the situation we're in today. Now, Trump administration, it has its own reasons for doing this. It has its own incentives for doing it. But Marco Rubio, I think, is probably instrumental in the continuation of it as a policy. But there is this constant push and pull. And I think at the congressional level, you get the push back. And I think that happens because the Cuban lobby inside the United States, the anti-Castro Cuban lobby inside the United States, has been very, very powerful for a long time. And they have capture of elements of Congress. But yeah, it's a parlous situation. I'm very proud of Steven for being there. And it's just a perfect evocation of US imperialism in 2026.
I mean, it's just so brazen now. We saw 100,000 people in Lebanon be displaced in one day. We've seen hundreds of thousands of people being displaced. We've obviously seen pogroms in the West Bank. We've seen an island of 11 million people basically losing access to electricity. We've seen maybe 2,000 people being killed in Iran. The United States quite haphazardly saying it doesn't mind if it nukes the economies of East Asia and Europe. It does really feel, and this is something we'll talk about in a moment, it does really feel like the mask has completely come off when it comes to America as an evil empire. You know, that's the phrase that Ronald Reagan used about the USSR in the 1980s. And I do think there was a recognition, even from supporters of the USSR, that the page was being closed on a certain political project. I don't think people foresaw the collapse of the USSR, but it didn't have the credibility, the authority, the growth model that it had in the 50s, the 60s, and for some of the 70s. It does now feel like we're in a similar moment with the US. Of course, the question is Trump the American Gorbachev? We'll find out soon enough, I suppose. If you want to see more of Steven's work from Havana, there's a new extended video report on our YouTube channel. The link to that is in the description below. Let's go to your comments. We've got one super chat, I think, from @JabsG7F, £1.99. You should cover the new UK fusion strategy. Very happy to. Actually, we talked about nuclear energy in that conversation with Angus Hanton. I'm not, all in on nuclear as a source of energy, but I think in colder climates with longer nights in the winter, like Britain, Scandinavia, Canada, Siberia, it's going to be very hard to get all the energy you need from solar. Like I say, at a certain time of the year. You've, of course, got wind as well. I wonder, is there a role for nuclear, particularly in those places? Angus isn't so sure. Donald Trump won the presidency twice, promising to reorient American politics. While not exactly anti-war, he was never a pacifist by any means. The Apprentice star wasn't as gung-ho as the neocons in the early 21st century. And unlike the Republican establishment more generally, he wanted to focus on blue-collar America through a project of reshoring American industry and addressing the failures of globalization. In other words, America first meant, well, putting America first. And no more stupid, avoidable wars was a foundation for all of that. That all now appears to have been thrown out of the window with the war on Iran. And those warmongering neocons, the old Republican establishment that Trump rallied against and defeated, well, they're loving it. A recent interview with Senator Ted Cruz on the YouTube channel Trigonometry was a great example of what I'm talking about. Have a watch.
Because there is a very real possibility in the next 6 months, we could see new governments in Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba. And if we end up with governments in those three countries that want to be friends with America rather than are enemies with America, that would be the biggest geopolitical shift since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now let me be clear. There are 1,000 ways that can go wrong. I'm not being Pollyannish and saying, oh, everything's wonderful. But on any objective level, the regimes there are weaker than they have been in our lifetimes. That is a moment of enormous opportunity. And so, look, at some level, it's going to be up to the people of Iran if they want a new government to step up and insist on that. I do think the president's putting pressure, weakening the regime and weakening the oppressive power of the regime makes them more vulnerable. And that, at the end of the day, I think that increases the safety of Americans.
The regime in Tehran was weaker in January. It was weaker at the start of February than it is today. And it was weaker because it didn't muster the kinds of democratic mass legitimacy and consent from much of the Iranian public that is evident on the streets right now. You've conferred legitimacy on the Islamic Republic, on the state, by making what was a war against the upper echelons of the government, whatever one's views on that, into a war on the country writ large. You killed over 165 kids in one double-tap strike. So the idea that Iran is now on the cusp of regime change, I don't think that could be further from the truth. It's certainly less true than it was a month ago. And whatever happened to putting America first? This is extraordinary. What about Americans? This guy is getting so excited about getting rid of this or that government in countries thousands of miles away. Now, of course, he has to pretend that's in the interest of the people that vote for him or vote for Donald Trump. He has to pretend that because otherwise he would look insane. He would look ridiculous. But fundamentally, he doesn't care about that. American politicians for a long time have given up on actually trying to improve America. It's too hard. There's too many special interests. It doesn't make you rich. It doesn't win you friends in powerful and influential places. It doesn't get you the great jobs on the side once you leave Congress. It doesn't help you fund a presidential bid. What does, however, is appealing to, like I say, powerful interests, particularly the Israel lobby. That's what the war in Iran is all about. Kieran, it's so striking. You know, I'm not a Trump supporter. I would never have voted for Donald Trump. I think if I was American, I wouldn't have voted for Kamala Harris either in the last presidential election. But there was something to that agenda of American economic nationalism, which I never thought he really believed in, but rhetorically it sounded very impressive, which was so powerful and so compelling, and actually, I think, was decisive in winning back, certainly in 2016, lots of former Democrat voters. People like Ted Cruz don't give a stuff about that. They're obsessed with foreign wars, intervention, regime change. It's crazy. It's almost, for me, and this might sound excessive, it's almost like a mental illness, this compulsion to focus on war abroad rather than actually trying to improve your own country, which, by the way, most governments in most places try and do most of the time.
Well, but if you're Ted Cruz, what are you going to do with your time? Because America is so corporatized. American free market capitalism is so pervasive. I mean, I've traveled across America a couple of times, and he's Texas, right? If you go through those heartlands, Aaron, it's astonishing. Look, I love parts of America. I think it's a very beautiful country geographically, but it is tragic. It's absolutely tragic what corporate power, special interests, and market capitalism have done to that country, to those communities. Now, you could argue it was a settler colonial country, and we can get into the history in a minute because we need to talk about American empire, I think, in a second, about, you know, its kind of inflection points. But yeah, it was a settler colonial country. Yeah, it was predicated on genocide. But the people that have been born there after and raised there, they grew up in a tragic situation in all but some kind of urban hotspots, in most cases, because corporate America, greed and unfettered capitalism has absolutely eroded their potentially, you know, beautiful country. And if you're Ted Cruz, how are you going to stay relevant? You've got to rile against demographic change. And actually, American population has stayed relatively static over the past 20 years. It's another thing, you know. So where are you going to find your bugbears?
Well, they have to pretend that Latinos aren't European, right? That's
right,
one of them.
exactly. And Ted Cruz trying to square that circle was an interesting one. But he's partly what I was talking about, the Cuban, you know, and the Latin American, some elements of the Latin American lobby or diaspora, as they call themselves. So, of course, they need to look to a different canvas. They need to tilt the table away from the American heartland because actually, in simple terms, there's always this kind of complexity bias. You want to say, no, but it's more complicated than that. And of course, in some ways it is, but they have accomplished everything they wanted. The Reaganite revolution is so absolute, and in any case, was so far advanced before Reagan in the United States that they have to turn outwards to find relevance, to remain relevant. You know, the whole world becomes the canvas after that. And I think that is a big part I think you're right. I think that's a big part of the explanation. It's like, you know, the do shit thesis. We need to do something. What are we for? We're irrelevant. We're a vestige because so much of our program has been accomplished in America already.
But they do need to do something. But the point is, you've got 40 million people until Trump did these reforms. You had 40 million people needing food stamps, right? Which is to say that if you don't have state intervention, 40 million people will be malnourished, right?
Right.
You have a situation where Chinese girls now, by the time they hit adolescence, are taller than American girls, which is to say that they're getting access to more protein in their diet, right? You have a situation where you're more likely to die in childbirth in the United States than you are in Bosnia.
Yes.
Right? And of course people say, well, let's break it down by race, because racist right-wingers say that. Guess where rates of female maternal mortality are lowest? California. Very diverse place in terms of the US. So there are so many challenges for American politicians to address, and yet the greater those challenges are domestically, literally the more fucked up the country gets at home, it's almost, there's an inverse correlation, the more stuff they want to do overseas.
For sure. Let me explain let me qualify what I mean. Of course, America is full of poverty, neediness, greed. There is so much desperation in the United States. So if what you want to do, Aaron, is address that desperation and that grotesque inequality and all of those indicators that you just talked about, and there are a million of them, of course, there is so much work to do. And that's what's so frustrating, is that, of course, if that's what you're in the market for, if that's why you got into politics, there is an endless amount of work in the United States ahead of you. So that's not what I mean. What I mean is that Ted Cruz and those guys will never do that, because it's not why they got into politics. They got into politics for selfish reasons. They got into politics for their own motivations. I don't want to sort of armchair analyse them all at a psychological level, but clearly individual gain, power, greed, and making America as divisive as possible, which includes those poverty indicators that you just rightly pointed out. Those are parts of the, that's the impetus for Ted Cruz and his ilk. And of course, they're ideologues, right? So if it conflicts with, market capitalism as an idea, they won't do it. And they are fatally captured by special interests. So if it goes against the special interests, as indeed education, healthcare, all of those tough things that you just pointed out, that in the 1930s, FDR did some of, as soon as they hit any resistance on that from their special interests or their donors, they're never going to do it, because that's not why they got into politics. And so that's what I mean. In that context, they turn outwards to seem relevant, to feel relevant. They turn outwards to the rest of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not an advert for democracy, is it? The extent to which rich people can just buy the political process. Oh, democracy, you can have NGOs and billionaires will buy the media, and actually your country will get worse and you'll just have permanent war. Doesn't sound good to me. Elsewhere in that interview, Ted Cruz went on to say this.
And the other challenge that you're facing is the Strait of Hormuz at the moment, because when you look at the natural resources going through there, the petroleum, the liquid natural gas, the fact that it's
fertilizer, helium,
the fact that it's been shut and it's been closed, and let's be honest, that is Iran's main trump card. That is a very real issue, not just for America, but for the globe in general.
Unquestionably, though, I will note the Europeans, who are more impacted by the Strait of Hormuz closing than America is, the Europeans have said, well, gosh, we don't like it, but we're not willing to do much about it.
I identify as Venezuelan.
That sounds very on brand for Europe at the moment, we say as Europeans, unfortunately.
What am I watching? What am I watching? These are the people that railed against identity politics, and I think Francis Foster is British. I'm Venezuelan. I know he's joking, but you have a clip there where an American politician is supporting a government, part of a government, it's his party, which is literally responsible for blocking the Strait of Hormuz, which, by the way, is going to lead, if things carry on as they are right now, is going to lead to a recession in Europe. We're not going to be able to access energy. We're going to have massive inflation. Interest rates will go up. If you have a student loan, good luck. Your student loan is going to start to get to 6, 7, 8%. Good luck remortgaging. You're going to pay an extra couple of £100 a month at least on your mortgage. If you're a renter, your landlord's going to have to pay more on their mortgage if they're remortgaging. You're buying food, the food inflation's going up. We had a year off from not getting poorer, and now we're going back. And it's literally directly attributable to the idiocy of the White House. And even then, because of course these people are blowing smoke up the arse of the American right, they have to say, well, we're sorry we can't support you in making us poorer. If only European politicians had the guts to support the White House in making Europe poorer, in making student loan interest even higher, in making it even more expensive to fill up your car. I wish they had the backbone, the resolve to support you in this brave endeavour. Utterly ridiculous. Now what that clip shows you, I think, is that the neocons won. Non-interventionist Don has become even worse than George W. Bush. I never thought I'd say that, by the way. Just when all the smart people were talking about the need for Washington to disentangle itself from West Asia and focus on China, they're trying to invade Iran. Now, is Iran a superpower? No. But it's a country whose population is 2/3 that of Russia, with a younger population and a culture of martyrdom held by millions of people. 2 years into his second presidency, and the Trump project has seemingly given up on any domestic agenda. I think that clip shows you that in spades. And I'm being serious, I've got evidence to this argument. Take Doge and reducing the size of the state. Remember when Trump and Elon were going to shrink the deficit and eventually the US debt? Well, it turns out that's going rather badly. This is from the Brookings Institution, a Washington-based think tank, a fortnight ago. Under the Congressional Budget Office's current projections for the next 10 years, primary deficits will average 2.1% of GDP. Net interest payments will rise from 3.2% of GDP in 2025, tied with 1991 as the all-time high, to 4.6% in 2036. So the interest payments are going to increase by about a third, and they're already at record highs, as the average nominal interest rate on government debt rises to exceed the nominal economic growth rate by 2031. This is a doom loop for the US economy. The unified deficit will approach 6.7% of GDP within 10 years. Even the cyclically adjusted deficit will exceed 6% of GDP. Debt will rise from 99% of GDP at the end of 2025, which is where it is right now, really, to 120% by 2036, well beyond the previous all-time high. Over the following 2 decades, the projected trends are even less auspicious. Sizable primary deficits persist indefinitely. The gap between the average nominal interest rate on government debt and the nominal economic growth rate continues to widen. I mean, any kind of gap is bad, but it's just getting wider, setting off the possibility of explosive debt dynamics. By 2056, relative to GDP, annual net interest payments reach 6.9%, the unified deficit reaches 9.1%, and the public debt stands at 175%. 175%. So Italian/Japanese levels, close to Italy, for the United States. All these figures would be all-time highs, except for the deficits during World War II, the financial crisis of 2008, and the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, those are all emergency situations, right? So outside of a war or a literal global plague or a rerun of the 1929 crash, we would see all-time highs and would continue to grow after 2056. Budget outcomes would be even worse under current policy projections. This is where it gets really funny. Or if you're American, maybe not. They incorporate more realistic policy choices than those required of the Congressional Budget Office in its baseline calculations. Making temporary tax provisions, such as those in the 2025 One Big Beautiful Bill Act, permanent. So Trump's quote-unquote temporary tax provisions, and we know when you do temporary tax cuts or tax rises, they generally become permanent. Making those permanent and making plausible assumptions about future discretionary spending to maintain government services would drive the debt-to-GDP ratio to 211% by 2056. This is from the guy that wants to reduce the debt. It's going to go from 99% to 120% to 175%, and if they keep the stuff that he's already pinned in as of last year, over 200% of GDP. Now, I know some people in the comments are saying, no, but they can print their own currency. They can, but people aren't going to buy the treasuries because they can't pay back the debt. they can do what they like. They're going to get a lot of inflation and nobody's going to buy the treasuries. So the US can get away with printing money indefinitely because it's not seen as an outrageously bad bet. It's relatively safe. And because of the petrodollar. It's almost like Donald Trump is trying to blow up American empire on purpose. It's almost like he's trying to accelerate the demise of the petrodollar, American unipolarity, everything. Now, if you think I'm just taking one data point, deficits and the debt, which, by the way, is just astonishing, right? All we heard for a year was Doge. I'm going to cut the size of the state. And now what we're hearing is 211% debt to GDP ratio. Crazy. Let's go to the jobs data. This is even worse in a way. Because it turns out the US lost 92,000 jobs in February. Sounds bad. What happened to tariffs on imports leading to American reindustrialization? Then there's this from Gallup, the pollster, who published this data earlier on today. New Gallup data confirmed the personal and professional environment of US workers was worse at the end of 2025 than at any point in the past 3 years across several important metrics. For the first time since Gallup began tracking the life evaluation of the US workforce, more workers report struggling in their lives, 49%, than thriving. For the first time, more are struggling in their lives than thriving, 49% to 46%. A stark reversal from 2022 and 2023, when more than half employees were classified as thriving. This is coupled with US worker engagement dropping to the lowest level on record in the past decade at 31% of engaged employees. So we've got the jobs data, we've got feedback from the American worker in terms of how they're feeling about things. We've got the deficit. It's not looking good. And then, of course, people say, well, the American economy is growing. It's booming. Hold your horses, because actually all of that is, guess what, debt fueled. Between 2020 and 2024, the US economy grew by $6 trillion. Sounds like a lot until you realize the debt increased by $12 trillion. In other words, for every dollar added with regards to debt, you're creating 50 cents of GDP. Normally, when you hear about a fiscal multiplier, it's $1 or £1 creates £2-3 worth of GDP, or 5 or 10. In the immediate post-war context in the United States, about $1 generated $10 of value. Now that's because of industrialization. Every year you add with regards to primary and secondary education creates a ton of value, and you get diminishing returns over time. Okay. But 12 trillion of debt and 6 trillion of economic growth is not good. And you add all the other stuff we're talking about, and all of a sudden, actually, the obsession with doubling down on war everywhere, all at the same time, Lebanon and Cuba and Iran and Venezuela and the West Bank, and God knows where next, starts to make sense. Kieran, the American right, American empire has always existed, and the American right has always been, I think, the most zealous with regards to prosecuting it. It's not to let the Democrats off the hook, but if you look at George W. Bush, you look at people immediately after World War II, the voices that were strongest in terms of using nukes on Korea, for instance, they generally came from the US right. But it does feel that with the American economic model in crisis, with the social model in crisis, they're going down with all guns blazing. And I mean literally.
This is what happens when empires fail. I mean, historically, the pattern is very consistent. And yeah, US empire, I'm kind of hearing from lots of quarters at the moment, certainly not here, that US empire has never been in the US until relatively recently. The Monroe Doctrine was proclaimed in 1824. That was 35 years, 40 years after the country was founded. So it's pretty early on. And then you're right that, the next big inflection point for American empire is the end of that century, 1898, the Spanish-American War, which was essentially a prosecution of, a realization of the Monroe Doctrine, which was, you will not do anything on the American continent, north or south. It's for the US to do it. So they kicked the Spanish out of Cuba and occupied Cuba, and went to the Philippines and did the same. And that was under Teddy Roosevelt. Well, it was under his predecessor, William McKinley, but he was a major driving force, and he's a Republican, of course. So yeah, tends to be the case. But even before that, Americans went into Mexico and colonized a lot of Mexico. Texas, Arizona, New Mexico all used to be Mexican territory in the Mexico War. So empire's always been pretty central to the US. And then, of course, the whole thing was manifest destiny, right? It went from one coast to the other and it colonized that land. That was a form of colonization or settler colonialism with an imperialist ideology behind it, manifest destiny. The white man's burden, as it was called. So yeah, look, that's just kind of American colonialism or imperialism 101. But I think it's important to say it. And now we get to a point where I don't think that there is much more for America to offer itself or the world. I don't want to repeat myself, but the social contract that underpinned the United States, if it ever existed at all, certainly does not today. And so that is part of the reason that empires, when they get to this stage in their histories, they tend to accelerate their own decline. They get stuck in a kind of tragic loop or a vicious cycle in which they start to try and do things that's in the narrow interest of the political class of the day, that isn't in the interest of the country, and certainly doesn't underwrite its longevity, precipitates its downfall much quicker than otherwise would have happened.
I mean, there's lots of examples of that, but then there are other examples. You look at Britain when it lost its empire. It was not like this. And there's an interesting hypothesis from Rana Dasgupta, who says that precisely because America doesn't have an extraterritorial empire, like the French, like the British, they can afford to be even more exploitative in a way. So we view this as a more progressive form of empire. His argument is actually it's in many ways more exploitative. There isn't formal slavery and all kinds of things like that. But in terms of actual value being moved from one part of the planet to another, it's much more efficient, is his view. And also they can afford to be less pragmatic. So when you've got an extraterritorial empire to administer, like the British in India or the French in other parts of the world, they make huge mistakes. They kill people, Amritsar massacre, Algerian war, etc. But you at least have to consider, if I do X, they'll do that. If I make this choice or this choice, there'll be different outcomes. Whereas, like you said, with these regimes or these states being a black box, they just look at Venezuela as, okay, well, what output are we getting? If we're not getting the right output, kill somebody and let's see what other outputs they do. Because they literally don't have to administer that country. They don't have thousands of soldiers there in a way that the French or British did in their empires. So we're looking almost at this unique situation where you have the imperial hegemon in decline. It doesn't have the extraterritorial empire, so it doesn't need to be as quote-unquote pragmatic. And also, it's protected by these two giant oceans. So the world can go to shit as a result of American foreign policy choices, but broadly speaking, it's insulated, broadly speaking. The Europeans will get the energy inflation, the Asians will get the deindustrialization, and the Russians and Europeans will get the displaced people and the refugees. And America gets none of it. So they can keep on making these crazy, outlandish, destructive choices. And actually the disincentives for them to stop doing that are quite low. And that's what terrifies me more than anything, right? The Europeans could destroy West Asia, the Middle East. They could destroy it. And you get 50 million people as refugees coming into Europe. And then all of a sudden Europeans, even on the right, would say, well, I don't want this is crazy. But that doesn't happen for the median Republican voter. So I'm kind of worried. I mean, fortunately, they're going to, or unfortunately for them, but fortunately from a geopolitical perspective, energy price rises, I would hope, will be something of a wake-up call for the Trump voter. We talked about this a bit before we came on air. We're going to finish up in a minute. But I think it's a really interesting conversation. I said, when Trump dies, I'll be happy. Okay? You can clip that. You can clip that. I'm not going to celebrate it, but I'll be happy. Inside, I'm not going to lie to you guys. Inside, I'll be happy. The guy is responsible for millions of people dying, I think, right now. That's the trajectory over the next 2 years. I will be a happy person. I won't celebrate it. By the way, it's a sin for me to think that. I know. But I'm not going to lie about it. And I think that my view is this is going so badly that if the next 2 years are like the last year, I think lots of Republicans, particularly in sort of elite circles, will try and distance themselves from what he's doing. What do you think?
So first of all, I'm delighted you've said that on air, and I will throw my towel in with you and say I'll be happy too. I'm sure. Can I say something briefly about what you said before about empire?
Please.
Very briefly. First of all, I think very interesting points, and definitely there are differences, huge differences, which we'd be remiss not to pay attention to. But there is an argument that Britain's kind of violent war moment was World War One, first of all, and that was the violent war moment that marked the beginning of the decline for all European empires. And actually, I think in Britain that holds true than it does in France. I think it really was a catastrophe for empire, for the British Empire. So I think that's the first point. The second point is there's always been this tension within America. So I can talk about American imperialism, American colonization, manifest destiny, and so on. But it is true that unlike with the British Empire, where there was this huge doctrine, all this infrastructure behind it, designed to reproduce the idea of empire, in the United States, some members of the elite have been genuinely committed to isolationism from the beginning. And that created a tension, I think, within the United States, which meant that it was never totally sure of its empire-building project in some instances, and that in the end conditioned it in some ways. So that's also another point on that. Do I think Republicans are going to distance themselves from him? Of course they will. Of course they will. They will distance themselves from him as soon as he falls on his own sword. As soon as he's out of power, they will come out of the wings to criticize him, to mark themselves out as distinct from him, to pretend to offer a distinct political program. That's just the way politics works. You know, when somebody's in vogue, when somebody's in season, when they're all powerful in your end of the political spectrum, as Trump was, you dummy up and you get behind them, unless you've got integrity, unless you've got some integrity. If you don't, as most of them don't, you dummy up, you get behind them, you're all smiles, you pretend. And then as soon as they're out of fashion, out of season, you line up with the assassins. That's how it works for people who don't have integrity. And unfortunately, that describes 97% of the political class on both sides of the Atlantic. Not 100%, but about 97%. That's just total arbitrary quantification.
I don't know. I think you're being a bit unfair on the UK. Although I should say, nobody in the government, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, maybe in the chat, maybe correct me, I don't know. Nobody in the UK is saying we're about to go into recession because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is going to cause a recession in this country. Your mortgage is going to get more expensive. Your energy bills are going to go up because of the Trump session. Don't call it inflation. Call it Trumpflation. That's what it is. Before we go, I want to play a clip from a Trump speech last year that he gave in Saudi Arabia. Have a look.
Before our eyes, a new generation of leaders is transcending the ancient conflicts of tired divisions of the past and forging a future where the Middle East is defined by commerce, not chaos, where it exports technology, not terrorism, and where people of different nations, religions, and creeds are building cities together, not bombing each other out of existence. We don't want that. And it's crucial for the wider world to note this great transformation has not come from Western interventionists or flying people in beautiful planes giving you lectures on how to live and how to govern your own affairs. No, the gleaming marvels of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were not created by the so-called nation builders, neocons, or liberal nonprofits like those who spent trillions and trillions of dollars failing to develop Kabul, Baghdad, so many other cities. Instead, the birth of a modern Middle East has been brought by the people of the region themselves, the people that are right here, the people that have lived here all their lives, developing your own sovereign countries, pursuing your own unique visions and charting your own destinies in your own way. It's really incredible what you've done. In the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built, and the interventionists were intervening in complex societies that they did not even understand themselves. They told you how to do it, but they had no idea how to do it themselves. Peace, prosperity, and progress ultimately came not from a radical rejection of your heritage, but rather from embracing your national traditions and embracing that same heritage that you love so dearly.
They had no idea. They had no idea what they were doing. They thought they could bomb you into democracy, and They thought intervention would make a difference. That was in 2025. I mean, he sounds like a completely different guy. And I have to say, when I saw that speech, and of course he's just reading from an article, he sounds quite bored, frankly. But in terms of the contents of the speech, I thought that was the best speech given by a US president in my lifetime about that part of the world. There was some recognition of state sovereignty. There's still US empire, of course, but it was a different kind of imperial relationship. It's almost like a co-partnership, which was quite different to the patrician overlord relationship that America had to the Middle East and West Asia really since the Second World War, right? So what's changed, Kieran? Either he's even more senile now than he was then, tick. Special interests are even more powerful now than they were then, tick. Or somebody has something on him. I'm not talking about the Epstein files, of course, I would never say that. Something really serious has changed, right? Because he's now saying and doing the complete opposite of those words from last year.
Well, I think it's a number of things. I think, first of all, you're right. He's more senile than he was, but he was pretty senile then. But I think more important than that, because you can keep a senile politician going for a while if you have people around them. I think that we've said this before, I've said this before on the show, everything that Trump says or writes or whatever is written in disappearing ink. You know, you really can't. We could do this all day. We could find clips, we could contrast them. I think a sort of technical way of putting it is that the incentive structure changed in the sort of intervening year or two. The reality is that I don't think that you can measure anything Trump says against anything else he says over a long period of time and expect it to stay the same. So I think that's another really important thing. And I think we don't know how historians will write about this era in 100 years or 50 years or 20 years. But I do think that will obviously, the constant chaos will be a key part of that logic. The other thing is, we shouldn't overlook that the Gulf is a key part of his, the Abraham Accords, it's a key part of American imperialism. Right? And there he's appealing to Gulf states. And of course, what he's saying is you're right, it's true. Excuse me. He's saying we can't just prize open your states and assume that they're all the same and then, mix the formula up a bit and expect the same results. All those are things that you and I support in principle, but it is also important to understand the Gulf state context there and the kind of the inside-outside interests going on. So, outside or inside from the American perspective would be the Abraham Accords and the kind of business dealings around that. It's just good old-fashioned US capitalism chugging along as it always has. So business as usual, continuity on that front. And then the kind of inside-out interests. So Vision 2030 from Saudi Arabia's point of view, and bin Salman's attempts to try and normalize Saudi Arabia and bring it out from I was going to say the cold, but that's not a very good analogy for a Gulf state. But you know what I mean. And so I think that's an important part of the context as well. So there is some rupture in what he's saying, but it's also business as usual continuity. But yeah, I think the overriding thing is, he's been captured by new special interests, and in any case, it's very difficult to trust anything he says over any kind of period of time.
I think that's true. The disappearing ink thing is absolutely true, but I also do just think he's senile. I think he's losing the plot. Let's go to some super chats before we go. And I have to say, we've gone a little bit longer than usual today. We've gone an hour and a half. We don't always do that. These are big stories, though, and we want to bring them to you. We are trying to build a new media for different politics. We've got kind of new setup. We're getting to a new studio soon. Novara is going to be so big, so fabulous, so bold, so necessary in 2026. If you want to help us get there, please think about becoming a supporter. Go to novaramedia.com/support. You have those direct debits at the end of the month, don't you? I have them. National Trust, RSPCA, RSPB. I pay the RSPB just to see those videos on Instagram of finding those scumbags who kill falcons and hawks. I would like to think Novara Media is kind of similar. When you see Rebecca doorstepping a landlord or Kieran dropping heat on an Instagram clip that's gone viral on Novara Live, you might think, well, that's worth my £2 a month. I'm happy to push the discourse in a positive direction. I think it's worth it. Like I say, if you agree, go to novaramedia.com/support. Let's go to your chats really quickly. Kev_loves with £5. Have been watching Brian Beletic Global war on multipolarism. Russia, Iran, and China are defending the global majority. Iran will endure this. There's something true to that, right? That will be framed as, oh, that's, you're cheerleading for autocracies. The brutal reality is, whatever you think of it, the majority of the global population does not exist in the political West, Europe, North America, Australasia, nor does it support the policy choices of those countries, specifically the US. It's even worse. If you look at Trump, 81% of the UK disapproves of the guy, right? 16% supports him, according to YouGov. So the idea that he is the leader of the free world, even in Britain, they don't think that. So what do you think they think in China or Indonesia or Pakistan? We've got another one here from Kev Loves. Novara should address the policy papers extending Russia, the path Persia. Everything in those papers has been executed. Now it's written down. And then £20 from Baz Camps. Kieran, it's been great talking to you tonight.
It's been an absolute pleasure as always, Aaron. I've now got to run off and see John Carpenter's The Thing at the cinema, but this will remain my favourite part of the whole day.
I'm glad to hear it. These are big stories, and, Trumpflation, Trump session. Don't stop saying those words.
The Donald Dip.
The Donald Dip. That's the one that's been patented by Kieran here. As I said earlier on, that full interview with Angus Hanton will be available on this channel tomorrow. My name's Aaron Bastani. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Kieran, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.